Ruthless Korean mafia boss heard no from a black pretty lady. And it broke something in him. Part 2. Nola turned her back on him. And somewhere in the back seat of a tinted sedan idling outside the gala, a tablet sat on a leather seat with her entire life digitized into a single, high-priority file. She didn't know that yet. She only knew that Park Min-jae was the first man in a decade who had dared to touch her elbow without permission, and every survival instinct she'd honed in the courtrooms of Lagos was screaming at her to keep walking. But Nola Williams didn't do retreat. She had built a legal empire in rooms designed to swallow women like her whole. She had learned early on that the only way to neutralize a threat was to look it directly in the eye and find its breaking point. So, she didn't quicken her pace. She paused, looked back over a shimmering red shoulder, and gave him the only thing he hadn't bought that night, her utter indifference. She told herself she had won the exchange. She had not won the exchange. 10 minutes later, he was no longer the mafia boss the room whispered about. He sat in the shadows of his car like a man who had finally found a riddle worth solving. No theatrics. No posturing. No army of enforcers blocking the exit. Just Min-jae, staring at her professional history on a glowing screen, looking at her like she was the most complicated piece of evidence he had ever encountered in a career built on never being caught off guard. He wasn't looking for a conquest. He was looking for the truth. He thought about the way she had spoken at the podium earlier that evening, completely. Most people in his world talked to fill the silence or to hide a lie. Nola spoke as if every word was a calculated strike, landing precisely where she intended. It should have been a warning. It wasn't. It was an invitation he didn't know how to decline. Let's take a pause. Kindly subscribe to my channel and tell me in the comments section where you are listening from. Thank you. Now let's continue. Park Min-jae didn't move. He stood anchored to the marble floor of the ballroom, the expensive weight of his velvet tuxedo suddenly feeling like lead. Around him, the gala continued in its predictable, gilded rhythm, the clinking of crystal, the polite, hollow laughter of people who traded in influence, but the air in his immediate vicinity had gone cold. He watched the red silhouette of Nola Williams as she moved through the crowd. She didn't rush. Her stride was rhythmic, a deliberate dismissal draped in shimmering silk. Most people, when they left Min-jae's presence, did so with a frantic kind of relief or a calculated bow. They scurried. They looked back to see if the monster was satisfied. Nola didn't look back to check his temper. She glanced back once, a brief, clinical acknowledgement, as if she were marking the location of a stationary object she had no intention of hitting again. For 15 years, Min-jae had survived by being the observer. He was the one who read the micro-tremors in a rival's hand, the one who saw the lie before it left a politician's lips, the one who calculated every variable before he even entered a room. He was the hunter, the analyst, the man who owned the silence. But as the high thigh slit of her gown vanished behind a pillar, a staggering realization settled in his chest, sharp and unwelcome. For the first time in his adult life, he was the one who had been read. She hadn't been intimidated by the hand tattoo that made CEOs stutter. She hadn't been charmed by the tailored perfection of his suit or the silent authority of the men standing 10 paces behind him. She had looked at him and seen exactly what he was, a man trying to exert control because he didn't know how to handle a variable he couldn't buy or break. Indifference. It was a weapon he hadn't prepared for. Min-jae reached up, his fingers grazing the silk of his bow tie, then dropping to adjust his cuff. It was a rare, restless gesture that Kwon Dae-sung, watching from the periphery, would recognize as a sign of internal disruption. Min-jae felt a strange, vibrating tension in his jaw. It wasn't anger. Anger was a hot, useful tool. This was something quieter and far more dangerous. It was a fracture. Something in the rigid, ironclad architecture of his ego had developed a hairline crack the moment she decided he wasn't relevant. He found himself fixated on the space she had occupied moments ago. He wasn't thinking about the Cho syndicate or the pending shipments in the harbor. He was thinking about the sharp, observant curve of her eyes. She hadn't just said no to his presence, she had analyzed his entire existence and found it lacking. To the rest of the world, he was an untouchable king. To Nola Williams, he was just a man in a black suit making a nuisance of himself. And that realization, heavy and staggering, began to burn. The velvet curtains of the gala had barely closed behind Park Min-jae before the atmosphere of refined elegance evaporated, replaced by the sterile, cold precision of his private world. Inside the armored interior of the sedan, the silence was heavy, vibrating with the unspoken questions of his men. Min-jae didn't look out the window at the blurred lights of the city, his eyes were fixed on the dark screen of a tablet. Dae-sung, Min-jae said, his voice a low scrape of gravel against silk. Kwon Dae-sung, his right-hand man, shifted in the front seat, his silhouette rigid. He didn't need to be told that the equilibrium of the evening had been shattered. He had seen the way the woman in the red dress had moved through Min-jae's orbit without being pulled into his gravity. "Find everything," Min-jae commanded, finally looking up. The intensity in his gaze was no longer just the focus of a businessman, it was the obsession of a man who had found a flaw in his own reality. "I don't want a surface profile. I want the bone structure of Williams and Associates. Every client, every offshore filing, every janitor they've hired in the last 5 years. If she breathes, I want to know the oxygen levels in the room." By the time the car reached the high-rise headquarters of the park organization, the digital dragnet had already been cast. In the sub-level monitoring room, the air hummed with the heat of high-end servers. Dae-sung worked in silence, his fingers flying across keys as he bypassed the encryption layers of Nola's firm. As the data began to stream across the monitors, the digital shadow of Nola Williams began to take form. On the surface, it was a masterpiece of corporate integrity. She was clean, frighteningly so. Her personal accounts were a boring testament to a woman who valued her sleep and her independence. But as Dae-sung performed a deep packet inspection of the firm's secondary trust accounts, the anomalies began to surface like wreckage from a deep-sea trench. Min-jae stood behind him, his hand resting on the back of the chair, his grip tightening as the screen filled with a web of shell companies. They were ghost entities. Blue Horizon Holdings, K-Alpha Logistics, Vesper Group, all layered with a sophistication that suggested a paramilitary level of financial engineering. "There," Min-jae whispered, pointing to a recurring transaction code. Dae-sung traced the source, and the blood seemed to leave the room. The codes were signature patterns of the Cho syndicate. Nola wasn't just running a law firm, she was standing on a landmine. The Cho syndicate had been using her firm's impeccable reputation as a hollowed-out shell to move their most toxic assets. They were laundering blood through her integrity, and based on the encryption logs, she had no idea the back door was even open. Min-jae felt a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. He had gone looking for a way to break her indifference, but he had found the blueprint for her execution. The woman who had just dismissed him was unknowingly acting as the ultimate shield for his most vicious rivals. She wasn't just a problem anymore, she was a target, and the Cho syndicate never left witnesses when their camouflage was compromised. The heavy oak door of Nola's penthouse clicked shut, finally sealing out the humid, salt-thickened air of the Lagos night. She tossed her clutch onto the marble console and stepped out of her heels, the cool stone floor a welcome relief against her tired arches. Despite the silence of the apartment, the strange energy of the gala followed her home like a persistent shadow. It was a vibrating, unsettled frequency she couldn't quite tune out, the lingering ghost of Park Min-jae's gaze. "You're home late." "I was about to call the hospitals, or at least the police," a voice drifted from the kitchen. Temi Adebayo leaned against the doorframe, a mug of herbal tea in her hand and an expression that was far too observant for midnight. Nola moved to the kitchen island, pulling her hair over one shoulder as she exhaled a breath she felt she'd been holding since the ballroom. "It was a long night, Temi. Longer than it had any right to be." Temi set a second mug down in front of Nola, her eyes narrowing. "You have that look. The one you get when a witness lies on the stand and you're just waiting for the court reporter to catch up so you can dismantle them. What happened? Nola wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, staring into the dark liquid. I met him. Park Min-jae. Or rather, he decided he needed to meet me. She recounted the exchange, the way he had tried to claim her space, the heavy silence that followed her no, and the inexplicable tension that had made the air feel thin. I walked away. I didn't even look back, not really. But the way he was standing there, it didn't feel like a defeat for him. It felt like a beginning. The playful light in Temmie's eyes vanished, replaced by a gravity that made Nola's pulse skip. Temmie had worked in high-level intelligence before Nola had poached her for the firm. She knew the difference between a persistent suitor and a predator. Nola, listen to me, Temmie said, her voice dropping an octave. I've seen the dossiers on the Park organization. Men like Min-jae don't just go away because a woman is indifferent. In his world, indifference is a glitch in the system. It's an insult to his architecture. She reached across the island, covering Nola's hand with her own. He isn't going to let that no stand as the final word. To a man who owns everything he sees, a person he can't possess becomes a fixation. He's going to start digging, Nola. He's probably already started. Let him dig, Nola replied, though her voice lacked its usual ironclad certainty. There's nothing to find. That's the problem, Temmie warned, her eyes darting to the window where the city lights flickered. When men like that find nothing, they create something. Or worse, they find the things you didn't even know were there. Be careful, Nola. You think you dismissed a man, but you might have just invited a ghost into your house. The city of Lagos exhaled its midnight heat, but inside her penthouse, Nola Williams felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her gaze sweeping over the urban landscape she had conquered with nothing but her intellect and a relentless no. Following her conversation with Temmie, the silence of the apartment no longer felt like a sanctuary, it felt like a vacuum waiting to be filled. She adjusted the lapel of her silk robe, a gesture of phantom armor, as she peered down at the street 30 floors below. At first, the street appeared as it always did, a vein of flickering amber streetlights and late-night taxis. But then she saw it. A sleek, obsidian sedan was parked at a precise, strategic angle near the entrance of her building. It didn't belong to any of the residents, and it lacked the impatient hum of a driver waiting for a fare. It sat perfectly still, a predatory shadow anchored in the light. An itch began at the base of Nola's neck, a biological alarm she had learned to trust in courtrooms when a witness was about to pivot. It was the sensation of being observed by someone who didn't want to be seen. She moved to the side, pressing her back against the cool glass, her heart hammering a jagged rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't just being watched, she was being encircled. What Nola couldn't see from her vantage point was the invisible perimeter Park Min-jae had established with lethal efficiency. 2 blocks away, a nondescript delivery van acted as a mobile command center, manned by Daesung's most disciplined tech specialists. In the alleyway behind her building, a silent figure in a dark tactical jacket checked his perimeter, his earpiece crackling with the low-frequency hum of a secure channel. Min-jae had not merely placed guards. He had constructed a fortress of human observation around her. Every exit was covered, every blind spot neutralized. He had treated the surveillance like a masterwork of forensic law, ensuring that if the Cho syndicate even breathed in the direction of her zip code, he would know before their shadows touched the pavement. Nola retreated from the window, her mind racing through her firm's current caseload, looking for any logical reason for this intrusion. She told herself it was just the lingering paranoia from the gala, a byproduct of Min-jae's intense, analytical gaze. But as she walked toward her bedroom, the sensation of eyes on her skin wouldn't fade. The untouchable attorney who had dismissed a king was starting to realize that a king's protection looked very much like a prison. The circle was closing, and for the first time, Nola didn't know if she was the hunter or the prize. The morning sunlight in Nola's office was clinical, cutting through the floor-to-ceiling glass with a sharpness that matched her mood. She sat behind her desk, the itch of the previous night having hardened into a cold, professional resolve. She was deep into a brief when the air in the room suddenly changed, a shift in pressure that signaled an arrival before her assistant could even buzz the intercom. Park Min-jae didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped into the room, his presence immediately making the expansive, high-tech office feel cramped. He wasn't in a tuxedo now, he wore a charcoal suit that looked like it was spun from smoke and steel, his hand tattoo partially visible as he adjusted his cuff. Nola didn't stand. She didn't even look up for the first 5 seconds, forcing him to inhabit the silence she created. When she finally did, her sharp, observant eyes were narrowed in a way that made it clear he was trespassing. "I don't recall seeing your name on my calendar, Mr. Park. And my security team is going to have a very difficult afternoon explaining how you bypassed 3 biometric scans. Your security is competent, Ms. Williams." "My resources are simply better," Min-jae replied, his voice a low, steady hum. He didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room, grounded and controlled, his porcelain skin almost glowing in the harsh morning light. "I am not here for a social call. And I am certainly not here to debate the ethics of my entry." Nola leaned back, her shoulders relaxed but her posture perfect. "Then why are you here?" "Because if this is another attempt at the predatory fascination you displayed at the gala, I'm afraid I have a firm policy against being a project for men with too much time and too little oversight." Min-jae's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle tension in his jaw, the first sign that her words had landed. "You think I'm here because I'm fixated on your indifference. You think I'm a problem you need to manage." "You are a problem I manage," Nola corrected, her voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. "I have managed men like you from Lagos to London. You are external power looking for a place to park your ego. I am internal power, Mr. Park. I am not a case file, I am not a conquest, and I am certainly not a damsel waiting for a protagonist." For a moment, the clash of egos was almost visible, a static charge between his status-driven authority and her ironclad self-possession. Min-jae looked at her, truly looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the broken curiosity in his eyes was replaced by a grim respect. Without a word, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim, unmarked digital drive. He set it on her glass desk with a soft clack. "Your firm is being hollowed out by the Cho Syndicate," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "They are using your reputation to wash blood off their hands. If you stay on your current path, you won't be disbarred, you'll be erased. That drive contains the forensic trail you didn't know existed." Nola stared at the drive, but she didn't touch it. "I didn't do this to buy your favor," Min-jae added, already turning toward the door. "I did it because it's a waste of brilliance to let a ghost kill you." He walked out before she could respond, leaving the untouchable attorney alone with a truth that threatened to shatter everything she had built. Nola stood motionless behind her glass desk, her eyes fixed on the door long after Park Min-jae's silhouette had vanished into the corridor. The air in the office still vibrated with the remnants of his low, gravelly warning, a stark contrast to the sterile hum of her cooling server rack. She looked down at the digital drive sitting on her desk. It was small, unassuming, and yet it felt like a kinetic weapon aimed at the very heart of her identity. She moved to the floor-to-ceiling window, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled back the sheer blind. From this height, the city looked like a complex litigation chart, every street a line of logic she thought she understood. Her gaze drifted down to the street corner directly opposite her building's main entrance. There, leaning against a lamp post with a deceptive air of casualness, was a man in a dark tactical jacket. Even from 30 stories up, the ink crawling up the side of his neck was visible, the same aggressive, artistic style as the rose on Min-jae's hand. The man didn't look up. He didn't pace. He simply occupied the space with the immovable weight of a professional sentry. Nola's breath hitched as she scanned the perimeter. 2 doors down, a black SUV with tinted windows sat idling, its presence a silent, armored exclamation point on the bustling Lagos street. A realization washed over her, colder and more profound than the fear she had felt during the confrontation. Min Jae hadn't fought her for the sake of his ego. He hadn't bypassed her security to force a romantic surrender or to prove his technical superiority. He had come to provide a shield. Every barbed word she had hurled at him, every defense of her internal power, had been met with a quiet, lethal pragmatism. He knew she was a target, and while she was busy defending her pride, he was busy defending her life. The invisible circle she had sensed the night before wasn't a snare, it was a perimeter. Min Jae had left his most trusted wolves at her gate because he knew the ghosts inside her firm were already sharpening their knives. She looked back at the digital drive, the smoking gun that promised to reveal a betrayal by someone she likely considered a peer. The untouchable Nola Williams, the woman who had built her career on seeing every move 3 steps ahead, finally understood that she had been playing the wrong game. She wasn't just an attorney in a glass office anymore. She was a liability being protected by the only man dangerous enough to stand between her and the Cho syndicate. The heavy door of the firm's archives room clicked shut with a finality that echoed through the rows of high-density filing cabinets. Nola Williams didn't turn on the overhead lights, instead, she let the cool, blue glow of her specialized laptop illuminate her face, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. Outside, the Lagos skyline was a blur of activity, but in here, time had slowed to the pulse of a digital forensic audit. The forensic fury, she felt, wasn't explosive. It was a cold, surgical precision that demanded absolute silence and total focus. She slotted Park Min Jae's digital drive into the port. For a moment, she hesitated, her finger hovering over the trackpad. To open this file was to officially acknowledge that the foundation of her life's work had been compromised. But Nola didn't do hesitation. She clicked. The data surged onto the screen. A labyrinth of mirrored accounts and ghost transactions that had been cleverly nested within the legitimate filings of her firm's most prestigious international clients. Min Jae's team had done the heavy lifting, but it took Nola's intimate knowledge of her own firm's internal shorthand to find the mole. She began cross-referencing the authorization timestamps with the firm's internal security logs, her eyes darting across the code with the intensity of a predator closing in on its prey. The deeper she went, the more the air in the small room seemed to thicken. The betrayal wasn't coming from an external hacker or a distant shell company, it was coming from the inside. Every unauthorized backdoor entry into the firm's trust accounts had been validated by a senior associate's credential. Nola's breath caught as a specific name began to repeat in the metadata. It was the Chitty Ease equivalent of her world, an associate named Marcus Bello. Marcus, whom she had mentored. Marcus, who had sat at her dinner table and toasted to the firm's integrity. He hadn't just sold her out, he had hollowed out the firm's soul to act as a laundry for the Cho syndicate's blood money. He had used her reputation as the untouchable attorney to provide the perfect camouflage for the very people Park Min Jae spent his life fighting. The fury finally broke through her professional veneer, a sharp, white-hot heat that made her grip the edge of the desk until her knuckles turned ivory. She wasn't just a lawyer looking at a case file anymore, she was the architect of a fortress realizing the person she trusted with the keys had been letting the wolves in every night. Nola leaned back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her narrowed, observant eyes. She didn't call the police. She didn't call security. She began drafting a counter-audit that would not just expose Marcus, but would trigger a digital collapse of the Cho syndicate's local assets. If they wanted to use her firm as a weapon, she would show them exactly what happens when the weapon decides to strike back. Thousands of miles away from the humid tension of Lagos, the air in Seoul was thin, sharp, and smelling of ozone. High above the neon-drenched arteries of Gangnam, the chairman of the Cho syndicate sat in a room that felt less like an office and more like a sensory deprivation tank. The walls were brushed obsidian, and the only light came from a sprawling digital display that mapped the syndicate's global interests in shimmering veins of gold and red. Chairman Cho did not look like a man who dealt in blood and shadow. He was dressed in a traditional silk hanbok, his posture so still he appeared carved from the very stone that surrounded him. But his eyes, fixed on a blinking notification from the Nigerian sector, held the predatory stillness of a deep-sea hunter. A digital alert pulsed on his primary console, a breach notification from the encrypted trust accounts managed through Williams and Associates. The chairman's fingers, long and deceptively delicate, tapped a rhythm against the arm of his chair. He didn't need a full report to understand the gravity of the signal. Someone was pulling on a thread that led directly back to the heart of the Seoul operation. Someone was looking into a dark room they weren't supposed to know existed. The asset in Lagos has become a liability, a voice whispered from the shadows of the room. A young man, his face a mask of corporate neutrality, stepped forward, holding a tablet that displayed Nola Williams' forensic audit in real time. She has bypassed the secondary encryption. Marcus Bello failed to contain her. Chairman Cho's gaze didn't flicker. He didn't care about Bello's failure, he cared about the integrity of the machine. Nola Williams was no longer a useful shield, she was a magnifying glass held over their most sensitive laundering nodes. Worse, the digital signature of the audit suggested she wasn't working alone. There were traces of a sophisticated, familiar hand, Park Min-jae's hand. The chairman picked up a secure, unlisted handset. He didn't wait for a greeting when the line connected to a safe house on the outskirts of Incheon. The attorney has seen enough, Cho said, his voice a cold, melodic rasp. She is attempting to burn the bridge while she is still standing on it. I cannot have a glitch of this magnitude in the Nigerian portfolio. There was a brief pause on the other end, the sound of a suppressed weapon being checked. Make sure she stops, Cho commanded, the finality of the order settling like a shroud. Before the sun rises in Seoul, ensure there is nothing left of the thread or the hand that pulled it. He ended the call, the obsidian room returning to its silent, suffocating peace. On the screen, the red vein representing the Lagos accounts flickered once, then went dark. The order had been cast, the ghost in the machine was no longer watching, it was hunting. The digital clock on Nola's monitor bled a steady, rhythmic crimson, 2:15 a.m. Inside the records room, the air had grown stale and metallic, filtered through the hum of overworked servers and the frantic heat of her own discovery. Her eyes, dry and aching from hours of navigating the Cho syndicate's labyrinthine financial architecture, finally locked onto the ghost she had been hunting. It was a single, innocuous transaction. A wire transfer masked as a routine retainer for a non-existent mining conglomerate in Busan, but the authorization signature wasn't just Marcus Bello's. Nested within the metadata was a secondary digital key, a mirror of her own administrative override, effectively tying the entire laundering operation to her name. The realization hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She wasn't just being used as a shield, she was being meticulously framed as the architect. If this file ever reached the authorities, there would be no defense, no legal loophole, and no way to prove her innocence. The Cho syndicate hadn't just infiltrated her firm, they had attempted to consume her legacy whole, planning to leave her to burn as the sacrificial lamb when the smoke finally cleared. In that moment, the untouchable Nola Williams, the woman who believed she could outmaneuver any threat with a sharp tongue and a deeper understanding of the law, evaporated. She was no longer a lawyer, a strategist, or a corporate queen. She was a target. A low, vibrating hum began to bleed through the soundproofed walls of the office building. It was a mechanical growl, persistent and cold. Nola moved to the window, her fingers trembling as she pulled back the blind just a fraction. Below, the street was deserted, save for the black sedan that had been anchored there all day. But the car was no longer static. Its headlights were off, but a faint, blue-gray vapor curled from the exhaust pipe into the damp Lagos air. The engine was idling. The man with the neck tattoo wasn't leaning against the lamp post anymore. He was standing by the driver's side door, his head tilted as if listening to a directive through his earpiece. The invisible circle hadn't just closed, it had solidified. Nola looked back at the drive Min-jae had given her, then at the evidence of her own destruction glowing on the screen. The sun was rising in Seoul, and the order to stop her had traveled across the world with the speed of light. She was alone in a glass tower, trapped between a betrayal she could finally prove and an assassin who was no longer waiting for permission to enter. Thank you for listening. Kindly subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for more interesting stories.